So if you could start with just your name and your birthplace.
Okay, so my name is Carmen Bonilla, and I was born in Puerto Rico.
And what is your first language?
My first language is Spanish.
Okay. And what is your profession?
I'm an English teacher, middle school teacher.
How long have you lived in the U.S.?
Okay, so I've lived in Florida for 4 years, but I was raised in Chicago. My mom moved to Chicago when I was like 9 months old,
Okay.
and then I moved back to Puerto Rico when I was 14, 15.
Did you move back with family when you
I
did
did.
that?
Mm-hmm.
So how did you become a teacher?
Well, I moved to Puerto Rico when I was 14, so I went to high school in Puerto Rico, and I realized that the only way students actually learned English was if they had a good English teacher. So I always knew I wanted to be a teacher, but I had a choice. Then I want to teach math because I love math, but then I was like, I think English because I would like, I wanted to teach English as a second language.
Okay. And where did you learn to speak English?
In Chicago.
Okay.
So when I went to school in Chicago, I remember maybe first, second, third, and fourth grade, I had a bilingual teacher. Moving on, fifth grade, 6, 7, 8, and 9, I had a monolingual class, which means it was all English. But at least the first 4 grades, I had a bilingual teacher.
Well, how did you feel being an ELL when you were that young, being an English language learner?
I think it seemed pretty normal because at home my parents spoke Spanish, so almost all my classes were in Spanish except for an English class.
Okay.
Now, as soon as I got to 4th grade, I remember mostly all my classes were in English, and I only had like 1 or 2 in Spanish. So I think that transition to the all English class was very smooth.
Okay. And it wasn't difficult for you? No.
It was not. I think maybe the code switching sometimes is hard because even now as an adult, I spend a lot of time at school speaking English all the time, but then I come back home and it's all Spanish.
Right.
So I would say code switching, like going back to Spanish and English like all the time, sometimes yes, it's a little bit confusing. Like I'm thinking of a word in English, but then I cannot say it in Spanish, or it happens the other way around. Like I want to say something in English, but I have the word in Spanish and I can't recall the word in English.
Wow. You're
So
very fluent, so it
yes.
seems to me like if I didn't know better, I would think that you were born and raised here. Did you, were you picked on at all, being a Spanish speaker and having all English classes?
No, not really. I don't ever remember like being treated different because I was like Hispanic or I had an accent or no. Now, I will say this. When I moved to Puerto Rico, I was kind of picked on in Puerto Rico because my Spanish was not perfect.
Is that right?
Yes. Now, when I came to Florida after 14 years, I remember going to my training to work at Bartow, and I remember telling one of my friends, she also moved from Puerto Rico after being raised in Chicago, and I remember telling her, like, Ms. Jimenez, did you notice now we do have an accent? And she was like, oh, we do have an accent. So it was kind of different, like, okay, so when we moved to Puerto Rico, our Spanish was not good, but then when we came back to the States, we were like, our English, you can tell, Spanish is my first language.
Okay.
Because I do have an accent, so yeah.
What is your earliest grade school memory? And it can be either Puerto Rico or here.
Memory. Well, like I mentioned previously, I always knew I wanted to be a teacher.
Right.
And the fact that I wanted to teach English as a second language maybe, and now I'm teaching English language arts.
Exactly.
So when I came here, I thought it was going to be easier because mostly all my students are English speakers, but it's not.
No.
So I know that initially I thought students will struggle if Spanish is their first language or if they have a different first language, but not necessarily. Even you can struggle in Spanish, like writing and reading, even if that's your first language, and that's the case with English. Even though English might be some of my students' first language, they also struggle.
I agree with that.
With reading and writing.
Right.
So I think that's something I can share.
Even doing work now in college, I have to go back and remember, okay, what is a suffix, what is a prefix? Because if you don't use use that stuff, you do forget it.
Mm-hmm. True.
Who did you live with when you were growing up?
Okay, so growing up, I grew up with my mom, with my brother, and my father.
Okay.
Stepfather, but I consider him my father. So.
Okay, and that was in Chicago?
That was in Chicago.
Okay. And were they bilingual, or they just spoke Spanish?
My mom just spoke Spanish, like she understands, but she's not a fluent speaker.
Okay.
My father, he was bilingual.
Okay. And we already talked about where you learned to speak English. Who lives with you here?
Well, my mom lives with me and my son.
Okay. And what do you speak with them?
Okay, so with my son, again, he code switches a lot. So we will start a conversation in Spanish, and he immediately starts speaking in English. With my mom, it's just Spanish.
Okay. All right. That's great that your son is learning both.
Mm-hmm.
Because now that he's so young, it'll be so easy for him.
And he moved 4 years ago, so he started his second grade here, and he picked up on the language like very, very fast.
And the work field just opened up for him tremendously because being bilingual, that opens so many doors for you.
Yes.
So obviously, I know you personally, and I know how important your family is to you, and I know that you work for them. Is that true in the Puerto Rican culture? Like, is family everything?
It is.
Yeah.
Family is everything. Like I just mentioned some minutes ago, my mom lives with me. So basically, some years ago, we lost her brother in Puerto Rico. So that's the reason why she's with me. Like, yes, it doesn't matter if you're 30, 40, 50, 60, like, family's first.
Right. Is it common in Puerto Rico for families to co-live together?
Yes, it's very, very common.
And do you find that is not so much in America?
Yes, I don't think.
Yeah.
I think that's like maybe the main difference. Like, I remember when I was growing up in Chicago, I used to think like, I want to be 18, I want to finish high school, I want to go to college, and I want to be alone and independent.
Right.
But then when I moved to Puerto Rico, it was like totally the opposite. Like, you grow up, you're 18, 19, 20, you get married, and maybe you go live with your parents, and it's okay.
Right.
Or you can be 30, 40, and your parents live with you, and it's okay. It's very normal.
Yeah, because family does come first.
Yes.
I love that about your culture, and I wish that more Americans would do that. I certainly would invite that for my own children to live with us. Is there anything else that you find culturally different in America as far as where you're from? Anything significant?
Not really. Like, being raised in Chicago and having that experience, like, that's all I knew until I moved to Puerto Rico. Because when I used to live in Chicago, it was just my mom, my dad, and my brother. It was just
And you were so young
so
when
I
you
didn't
moved
exactly.
there.
I didn't have like family members that lived in Chicago, so I didn't really relate to my family as much when I was growing up. So when I moved to Puerto Rico, then I had to say just the fact that family is very, very close, and they like celebrate everything, and tradition is everything, and Christmas, and everyone gets together, and every time there's an opportunity like to get together to celebrate something that might be like, why are we celebrating, or what are we celebrating?
Just an excuse.
It's just an excuse. So I would say maybe that.
Yeah. Do you miss that?
I do.
Yeah.
I do.
You still have a lot of family that live in Puerto Rico?
All my family except for my mom. My mom and my son. Like, it's just the three of us here.
What is your plan? Do you plan to stay in the States, or do you plan to go back to Puerto Rico?
I've thought about it. I think, like, at the moment, I would like to stay because I would like my son to finish his school and go to college if that's what he wants to do.
Right.
I don't know. Maybe vacation in Puerto Rico. Maybe retiring in Puerto Rico.
Right.
But I don't know. Maybe in the next 10, 15, 20 years, but not now.
Okay. So, how do you feel that you have acclimated to the American culture? I know that you were raised in Chicago, so this probably feels like home to you.
It was, I would have to say, yeah, it was smooth. When I came 4 years ago, like, a lot of it was not new for me because I was raised in Chicago, so it's very similar. I mean, it was a big change. I'm not going to say it was not. And even though I was raised in Chicago, I still struggle. Like the first few months, just I would say maybe, especially at Bartow Middle School, initially it was like a cultural shock. It was quite different. And even though I was raised in Chicago, it was very different from Chicago as well. So I would have to say, yeah, maybe it was a little bit hard the first few months, maybe the first year, if I'm being honest.
Right. So what brought you here 4 years ago?
Okay, so honestly, like teaching in Puerto Rico, the pay, I'm not gonna lie, I used to have 3 jobs. 3 jobs.
And a son.
Single mom.
Yeah. Wow.
And teachers don't get paid in Puerto Rico, so I was really struggling economically.
Right.
I was back in school getting my master's degree, and I just read a flyer that Polk County was going to go to Puerto Rico, interview and recruit teachers, and I thought that was just a great opportunity for me to come here and bring my family with me and just give them a better life.
Perfect. And I'm so glad that you did, personally, because I adore you.
Thank you.
And you never feel culturally displaced at this point, now that you've been here for
No,
2 years.
not really. No. I think, like I said, it was a little bit hard at the beginning because obviously I missed family and I was alone and it was different, and teaching here was quite different from teaching back in Puerto Rico.
Right.
But I don't regret it. I don't.
Good.
I don't.
Good. So, being a future teacher, what advice would you give me as far as teaching my future ELL students? I know that because Spanish is your first language. Okay, so being that I'm a future teacher, and I know that you have empathy for ELLs because that was you back in the day. What advice can you give me? How can I help my ELLs feel more comfortable? And obviously I don't speak their language, although I am trying to learn, but how can I help them feel loved and just as important as my English speaking students?
Well, I would say the first thing, and it would be just treat all your students the same. I think, let me see how I want to word this nicely.
Okay.
Not only with my ELL students, I think with all my students, I always try to treat them fairly. I don't want them to think or notice that I have favorites, and the only way you can do that is you treat them all the same. So that would be the first thing. Now, when it comes to maybe helping them, there's a lot of strategies we can use to help those students. Like in my case, I use a lot of my body language. I do have strong body language. So when I really want them to grasp or get a concept, I think that's one thing I do use a lot, like my body language, to convey meaning. That's one thing I do. Just break everything down to them. Repeating instructions, just making sure they do understand, directly asking them, like, do you understand? Do you need help? Just showing them you care, but at the same time, not making them feel different to the others.
Because as they go through all of these classes with English speaking teachers and us using our body language to show them it's time to stand up, it's whatever it is that we need to do, it will eventually click.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. That's
And
great.
the other thing is just exposure.
Right.
That's the truth. The only way they're going to learn is being exposed to the language.
Do all of your students have the same textbooks, or do you have any Spanish textbooks that are special for them?
They all have the same textbooks. I do know maybe an ESOL teacher will have dictionaries, or will find other ways to help them like understand meaning if they need that. But I do have students that I know for sure their first language it's Spanish, not English, and sometimes I do notice they do like struggle to understand or comprehend. So repetition, and like I said, a lot of body language and exposure. Like I don't make it easier for them. I don't change the language. I don't say it in Spanish, because I would say being exposed to it is what's really going to help them. Like my son, why did he pick it up? He had a monolingual teacher. It was all English. So even though he struggled maybe the first few weeks, the first months, he was exposed. Like, that's all he heard at school, so
Right.
he learned.
Do you think it would have hindered his learning had he had a Spanish textbook?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I have to be honest. And maybe people think, no, maybe that's too harsh, that's too hard. But it's the only way.
I love that.
If you feel like you have to, or the need, survival, you will learn. You will pick up the language. You will find those words that you need and are going to be useful. And I'm just thinking back in college, total physical response. That's using your body language.
Okay.
It's like babies. Like when they learn to speak, like, why do they learn? They're imitating. They imitate sounds. You say the bottle, you show it, you move it. And I think that really helps when it comes to English. It's the same way, baby steps.
That is perfect. That's beautiful. Miss Bonilla, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for coming.